Hello, progressive chess fans. This is Kazio, and I'm going to be talking today about progressive chess endings. Uh, the the first thing you might think is that if one side has 11 moves, 12 moves, 13 moves, etc., that there's no possibility of zugzwang in progressive chess endings, but this is actually not correct. One of the key aspects of progressive chess in games is that white has to make an odd number of moves and black has to make an even number of moves. Remember, you cannot voluntarily end your series early unless you can deliver check. So this leads to positions that I call parity positions, like bits 0 and 1 parity or toggle positions, where black can win them but white cannot. So the first and simplest example of a parity position is this one with the white king on f6 and the pawns on g5 and g7 and the black king on g8. And we see that black has no problems holding this position. Suppose he has 16 moves, he can just go back and forth between h7 and g8 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And because he makes an even number of moves, he will end his series on g8, which is fine and is a draw. Now let's look at a mirror image of the same position with white to move, and we see that this is a problem, that white loses this position. If he were to have, say, 15 moves, he would have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, and with his 15th move, or whatever his odd number move is, he would land on a2, and black would simply proceed to checkmate him without any problems. Now this might seem like, oh well, why are you showing us these positions? This isn't exactly relevant to progressive chess theory, is it? But it turns out it's extremely relevant, and black can deliver checkmate to white with a bishop and a knight, whereas white cannot deliver checkmate to black with a bishop and a knight. Because of this phenomenon, black can force white to the back rank, whereas a black's king in a similar situation cannot be forced into a checkmating position. And the most fascinating one coming from chess is that it is also possible to checkmate with a king and two knights in progressive chess for black only. Again, because of these parity positions. And I'm going to go through these a lot of the analysis and work on these. Bishop and knight checkmate and the two knight checkmate was done by Russell Linneman, an expert who did a lot of the work on progressive chess endings. So I'll get to that in a moment, but first I'm just going to go through the basic positions. For example, it's rather obvious that let's just look at what material is needed to checkmate a lone king. It's rather obvious that a queen can deliver checkmate because the king can protect the queen, and so there's no problems here. With each subsequent move, black would be forced back no matter where he was, and you can always imagine a setup like this where you just push black back one row each turn until checkmate. But there's also other configurations. The rook, it's obvious that there's no way to deliver checkmate with the rook. Because you can't check with the rook and still defend it. You can only have a position like this, and this doesn't force black to do anything. He could just move around all he wants. In order to deliver check, you need a configuration like this, and no matter where on the board this is, black's king can just walk over and take the enemy rook. So we can see a rook in progressive chess is not sufficient for mate, and neither is a bishop or a knight. So now we'll get into the fun checkmates. So first I'm going to look at king and bishop and knight versus king. So it should be rather obvious that if you can get a piece onto the onto the back row, we can deliver checkmate like a configuration like this. And it's relatively easy to see how to force this type of position once the king is on the back row. In a position like the following, it's clear that if white has to shuffle, he's going to have to end on d1 and get mated there. And this is sort of the basic idea. But how do we actually force the king onto the back row? That's the interesting problem. So for example, suppose the king is sitting here on the second rank in the middle of the board, then we can see that this position in fact if this is the starting position, then black could arrange his pieces like so. And we see that white has no choice in this position, even though the pieces are so scattered and far apart like this. It's very beautiful. White has to go back and forth between e2 and e1, and that's all that's available to him. And so if white has an odd number of moves here, he has to wind up on e1, and then he gets mated, as we saw before. And the bishop and knight don't have any problem actually forcing the king back. For example, position like this on the same color as the bishop, you could imagine a position like this. And we can see that that white is forced back in this position. He has to, if he plays a d1, he gets mated, so he has to consent to being further boxed in and being pushed back. Let's see some further examples. If the king is in the third layer in the corner, you can force him back with this configuration. And here, again, we see that that white has no choice but to oscillate between a6 and b6 and wind up on the square a6. So many of these positions are forced. Well, okay, he can't move to b6. That's check. So some of these positions, it's either black uses check to force white back, and those are positions where white could also do the same to black. But the main point is that in order to actually deliver checkmate, you have to get to one of these so-called parity positions. And in those positions, black's king would be able to just sit there, whereas white's would not. One final example of the bishop and knight would be this position. Sorry, knight on f4. And again, we see here, what pattern that by now should be familiar. And the problem isn't that white can get black's king to a position like this, but the problem is if this were black in this position, he could just move back and forth and then end on the same square he's already on. So only white actually loses here by having to go to d1. So let's move on quickly and look at king and two knights versus king. So suppose this is a knight. Now the first thing is to show, like, well, how do two knights actually even checkmate a king? So I'm just going to show some of those patterns. In the corner, it's a rather obvious pattern, like you would arrange the knights like so. And so it's not that two knights can't checkmate in regular chess. It's just that they can't force the king onto these terrible squares where they get mated. Here's an example of being checkmated on this square, a3. So we can see that this square isn't even safe. That there's a pattern here with the king covering and getting checkmated. And then even if the king is here on b2, there's a checkmating pattern like this. Okay, that's actually a parity position. Okay, this must just be how you would force the king. This is the method to actually force the king into the outermost layer. This is not a checkmate position. So if you can get the king to this square b2, then you can force him into the outer layer here, because he has to go to either here or here. And if he goes to a2, this square cannot be checkmated. a2, h2, h7, and a7, black cannot checkmate white on, or cannot directly checkmate him on those squares. He has to force a parity position and get him off that square. And this is why, black, if he were on a2, h2, h7, or a7, could never be forced off it, but white can. So in this position, obviously, if he goes to a1, he just gets checkmated in the corner, so he would go to a2. And now we can see a key parity position with the king on one of these squares, which is like follows. And this is how you actually force the king into the corner. You simply cover all the squares, and white's king here would have to oscillate between a7 and a8 and wind up on a8 where he would get checkmated. There's a few other key parity positions on the b6, g6, g3, b3 squares. There's a parity position like this. And we can see here that white can't go to c6 or c7. So he has to oscillate between a6 and b6. And once he gets to a6, he gets checkmated. And then there's this configuration. So even here on the second rank, he gets paritied. And in this position, we can see he can't go to c7 or c6, can't go to d6, so can't go to c8, so he has to oscillate between d7 and d8. And as we've seen, he gets checkmated on d8. As for the actual act of forcing into these back row, that's not too difficult, and in fact, this can be done by either color, where you just play a configuration like this, for example, and the knights actually cover a surprising number of squares, and white cannot stay in the center here. If he's in a position like this, you can restrict his mobility like so, and again he will have to retreat. He can't stay in this area here, which I call the the innermost. I think of this in layers, like the 4 and then 16 and so on. So the idea is to drive him back by layers because the squares on the edge are basically symmetrical. It doesn't matter where they are. It's the same mating configurations, just flipped around. So knight here. This is another method forcing out of the center. So that should give you the basic idea of how to checkmate with king and bishop and knight against king, and king and two knights against king. The safe square nature of the safe square is a2, a7, h2, h7 is worth noting that black could just park his king on one of those. So this raises the question: well, in regular chess, who really needs to know king and bishop and knight against the king? It's such an obscure checkmate. You might happen one time in your entire chess playing career. But as we've already seen in progressive chess, there are quite a few. In fact, minor piece endings are the norm. They're like the rook endings rook endings are to regular chess, as minor piece endings are to progressive chess. Having said that, in 90+% of endings you get into, there will be pawns on the board. It's very hard to completely liquidate all the pawns and get to exactly a king and two bishops or a king and two knights, etc., etc. Oh, incidentally, I didn't show king and two bishops, but that one should also be rather obvious how to checkmate. Either side can deliver checkmate with king and two bishops. So the next question is, well, what about pawns? So if we clear the board and look at, like, for example, king and pawn against king. Now, sometimes king and pawn against king is a win in regular chess, but in progressive chess, there's obviously no way for white to make the black king do anything here. So in order to win in progressive chess with king and pawn, white's king already has to cover the queening square of the pawn and defend it, and then he would be able to win on the next move. And usually that only happens when he's ended his series in that configuration, because otherwise he would have just queened anyway. So then the question becomes, well, what about two pawns? Well, two pawns, it should be rather obvious that this is a win, that a configuration like so. But if the pawns are split, if the king can defend both of them, it's a win. But in a situation like this, unless it's white to move here, there's nothing he could do. Black can easily defend this by just snatching the pawn. This is what I called a frog tongue in an earlier video, where black on his move can essentially just lift the b4 pawn off the board and say go, assuming he has enough moves. Even in a situation like this, if black has enough moves, then he can draw this position. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So we can see that he would need, well, I guess he can draw if he gets to here. So he would need 13 moves, so 14 since it's black, to be able to hold this position. So that's something that's kind of interesting. It does depend on how many moves you actually have. So the farther apart the pawns are, the better it is. In terms of adding pieces, nearly any piece is sufficient to win because it can deliver check.